And the answer to that is the judgment of the Supreme Court on May 13th of this year. Supreme Court castigated the central government, asked them for responses. There were daily hearings. I feel slightly awkward because it was our case. Swaraj Abhiyan had taken this case. And Supreme Court asked for weekly reports on how much money are you going to put into Manrega, as a result of which the government of India was forced to do so. And this figure of 48,000 crore is actually substantially lower than Government of India's legal obligation. Their legal obligation is to give person days equivalent to the projections made by states. And if you simply multiply person days by the per day cost of Manrega, you are actually looking minimally at 62,000 crore rupees. Or if you take state projections, you are looking at 80,000 crore rupees. If you look at the reduced agreed to budget of the central government, you are looking at 62,000 crore rupees. And here we are celebrating 48,000 crore rupees. This is the story. So in other words, just to come back to the question of political will, I think we are gradually receding in a situation where this what I call imbalance of power is becoming like a cement. The cement is drying, that imbalance is becoming permanent, part of the political economy of the Indian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yogendra. Many of the points that you've covered, we're going to discuss in greater detail, maybe not in the kind of detail that many of us would like. I have a request. All those who are standing there, why don't you sit here on the aisle, and there are a couple of seats there. You'll be more comfortable. Okay. Before I move on to Manrega, and it's an important topic, I have a question here. On the 31st of December, we saw the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He sought to address what many believed those sections of the population who were worst affected by the demonetization. Who were these people? I mean, of course, there were daily wage laborers, there were the homeless, but importantly, there were small traders, there were women who save a lot, especially rural women, senior citizens, elderly citizens. So the question here is that the optics of it, was there an attempt made in this budget and a continuation of the mini budget of the 31st of December to assuage the hurt that these sections of the population had suffered on account of demonetization? So this is a question, and any of you here are free to respond. Yes, please.
So I wouldn't read too much into all this stuff. I would invite Ratin to put one of his research assistants on the finance minister's speeches since 71 and find me one speech which does not claim to be pro-poor. In the past 46 to 50 years, find me one finance minister's speech which does not say, this is what I have done for the poor. The reality is, this is a farce. What is being done is not addressing the real roots of the problems of why poverty persists in this country. Because that would require to look at distributional issues, which you are not looking at. You're looking at the issue of poverty largely in terms of handouts. And there's no difference in the 31st December statements or what you have had now. Yes, there's a little bit on skill formation, etc., etc. But what's the point of skill if you don't have an economy which is generating jobs? So I would say that I would read so much into all this. It is something, as a former chief economic advisor, I assure you, having written speeches, that we have always done this, that we have the instructions to play out this dimension. The real problem is what Yogendra was mentioning, the fact that I would say now, certainly for the past 40 years, there has been no willingness to address the issue of incomes at the higher end. Now, one of the reasons why demonetization did attract some popular support was, for the first time, some people felt, at least something is being done to catch these fat cats. Because up till then, no government had done anything. And in fact,
We now even have the numbers, and we said how many Jan-Dhan accounts. But the big question is, are you really going to take action against them?
No, the problem is that they had really misconceived the whole thing. I think that, but the fact is we have to recognize that initially it was received with, positively by a lot of people, because really for the very first time there was some a feeling that these people did, but unfortunately that's not what has happened. If the evidence is to be, if 97% of the money has come back, yes, sure, the income tax will chase people, etc., for the next 6 years, trying to find all this. But the reality is that all the fat cats have probably whitewashed their money anyhow. And the people who have been left in the lurch are this poor woman sitting somewhere in a village up in the Uttarakhand who had maybe 400 or 500 rupee notes or 4,000 rupee notes. Who were sitting. It happened. Do you remember there was an episode when this lady, poor lady with 400 or 500 rupee notes went to the Reserve Bank to change them, and they refused, saying that she doesn't have an ID. I mean, some humanity has been shown. If I had been there, I would have said, you give me the notes. I'll use my ID and tax. But even that is not there. So I would say that it was popular, but I suspect that it will soon people will discover what it actually did. Unless they catch a few big names through this chasing business, I'm afraid that politically it will be a major problem for the...
One Vijay Mallya is not enough, you mean?
In fact, there is a Vijay Mallya provision in this budget. There is a Vijay Mallya provision in this budget where they say that you can seize they have legislation for seizing assets. Let us see whether they do it. Let us see whether they do it.
All right. Okay. Annie?
देखो डिमोनेटाइजेशन की वजह से हमारी देश की हजारों लोगों की एम्प्लॉयमेंट अपनी हाथ से निकल गए
हजारों क्यों बोल रहे हैं आप?
लाखों
करोड़ों
करोड़ों लोगों का तो that starts with a domestic worker से लेके कितनी स्मॉल एंड मीडियम स्केल जो एंटरप्राइजेस क्लोज डाउन हुआ है उसकी वजह से लाखों करोड़ों थैंक यू सर तो उस वक्त it was an opportunity for the government to help the people who are actually the victims of demonetization through providing more budgetary allocation for NREGA. Now what initially what I said, it is a sugar-coated lie. The highest ever allotment for NREGA. What is the highest ever allotment of NREGA? You have pending liabilities. And so in that case, in a real sense, it is not more than a few hundreds of crores. Actually, as women organizations, Smita is sitting here, we have asked the finance minister to allocate 70,000 crores for NREGA. As Yogendra was telling, if you calculate it in a sincere way, then you need that much money. And interesting thing is, it is a demand-driven program or an act. So you will have to ensure, the central government will have to ensure money with the state government. So now out of 34 states, 22 states are having a negative balance because they don't have money. Now till 31st they will have to run the program, and this is the peak time because before 31st people will go because it is 100 days entitlement. So they will try to complete that 100 days from February or January to March. So this is the peak time. So where is the money?
Okay.
Where is the allocation? So it affects. मैं एक महिला organization की महिलाओं के बीच में काम कर रहे, गांव के स्तर की महिला के बीच में काम कर रहे, इसलिए मैं बोल रही कि जो डिमोनेटाइजेशन की वजह से सर मैं ये भी बताना चाहती हूँ कि मैं केरला से हूँ. केरला में सब काम करने के लिए ओडिशा से, बंगाल से, बाकी झारखंड से सब जगह से आ रहे. Now they don't have, thousands of people are there, lakhs of people are there, they don't have work now. So now they are begging, they are saying, sir, you give 100 rupees, we are ready to work. What is the situation of their families back in either in Orissa or in West Bengal? So in that situation, government could have allotted ईमानदारी से एक अलॉटमेंट इस देश की जनता के प्रति बजट करें. इसलिए मैंने बोला कि बजट should reflect the socio-political reality of the people of this country. That is not reflected, and it is it's very, very unfortunate. I don't know. As soon as this government came into power, the first announcement in the parliament was we are going to wind up. It is a waste. This was. Then the second was we will have a 200.
Living monument of the failure of the
Yes.
Congress party.
And
This is
then-
what the Prime Minister said in the Lok Sabha.
Lok Sabha. And then they said priority blocks. So many states refuse to provide work to other people who live in other blocks. So these are all problems. Now with such a little, actually you can say no, this is equal to nothing. Budgetary allocation for the coming financial year, I don't know what will happen with the demonetization impact.
All right. You know, there's one question. Yeah, please. I'd like the panel here, anybody wants to, 2 points on Manrega that we haven't really talked about. One is this whole thing that we are going to build in the current financial year, 10 lakh bonds against a target of 5 lakh and 10 lakh compost pits. I mean, in a country where an estimated 7 lakh villages or a little under 7 lakh villages exist. So you're talking about more than one pond and one compost pit for every village. You also talk about durable assets. So this is one question I had. The other question I also have is, Manrega was supposed to at least reduce migration from rural areas to urban areas. Have we seen a reversal of that trend because of demonetization, where people have actually, the loss of livelihoods and job in cities have made people go to rural? These are the questions I had. I mean, Praveen?
Whatever limited evidence we have based on newspaper reports and studies by several NGOs, etc. You know, if you put all those together, on the second, it seems quite clear that yes, that was indeed the case. You know, for instance, from Anand Vihar terminal, trains going to Bihar and UP, on an average, if it used to be before demonetization, if the traffic was about 2,000 persons per day, it increased to about 6,000 persons per day. Right? They went back to their villages. Likewise, if you look at reports of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, on what happened in Dharavi, close to 90% of small enterprises, at least temporarily, wound up their work. And the workers went back. Yeah, there were quite a few who were migrant workers there and so on. So if you just add up all these stories, you know, there was a press report only 3 days ago which said that the numbers are easily somewhere close to 2.5 crores or so. Now again, I mean, as I said, unless we have very carefully done statistical exercises, it's not very prudent to say, okay, this number is better than the other, but on the whole, all the numbers that you have clearly indicate that on that reversal of the sort of trend, even though if you look at last 5 years, what the numbers which were quoted in the economic survey, for instance, the flow of people from rural areas to urban areas has actually doubled, right? Now, which essentially tells you a very complex story of massive distress in rural areas, some opportunities in urban areas, and then if that is the backdrop, and when you are hit by something like this...
But Praveen, this is pre-demonetization.
Exactly, that's what I was referring to. And, you know, because there was a strongly felt need that we need regular information on things like employment and labor conditions and so on, and that's why Labour Bureau has been conducting annual surveys now, which are much smaller than our large-scale data systems in terms of coverage, of course, but they give you a great deal of insight into what possibly is happening at the All India level. And if you look at those reports, okay, what is happening to employment generation, for instance. It's an extremely dismal story. If you go by NSS, unemployment rate is 5 point something. According to this, it's now 13 point something now, right? If you look at what it was in 15-16 compared to 14-15, there's a significant 2-point increase almost, right? So, in any case, situation was pretty bad. On top of that, if you have a scenario which is forcing people to wind up their things everywhere, rural, urban, and
Okay.
so on.
Okay. Yogendra, I'm going to come to you on Manrega. Yes, sure. But is there anybody over there, Ashutosh, Renu, Ratin, who would like to make any comments
On Manrega?
on Manrega
Yes.
and what has been
Yes.
stated so far?
Yes, I want to, you see the fundamental rationale for having the program is it's demand driven. So it has an element of it's supposed to be counter cyclical. So I want to question the increase in outlay
Ratin
from
doesn't like
38
that
counts,
phrase.
at a juncture when the monsoon is expected to be normal on the back of a very good monsoon last year, and whereas in 2 successive years of drought these provisions were not enhanced, and so if the correct picture of the monsoon will be known only by sometime finally in June, in May. So the enhancements can always be made can be made by supplementary demand for grants. So
Okay.
that makes me very
Yes. You would like to say something? Ashutosh?
Not on Manrega.
Okay.
Yeah, not
Ratin,
on Manrega.
you'd like to
Perhaps later on demonetization.
All right. Yeah, please.
Actually, my point was related. You see, in theory, Manrega is a demand-driven program. In reality, it is not. Absolutely not. The theory says, someone in village says, I need job. He or she fills up a form, the form goes there, and then necessary number of jobs are created, otherwise that person is paid a certain allowance. Nothing of this sort ever takes place anywhere in this country. Because if that was the case, as you rightly point, in which case you cannot actually have allocations for Manrega. You can only anticipate. That's all you can do technically. But as you know, this is not the reality, and this is not also the accounting reality these days. The Government of India has created 2 things. One is called the projected budget. Every state government gives you a month-wise projections of what they expect to be demand. On what basis they expect, God knows. These are usually last year's figure multiplied by 0.2 or some such thing. They send projections. Those projections are added up. Last year, those projections added up to 31.5 million person days. Then the Government of India, through a certain process, which again God knows what, brings it down and comes to something that is called agreed to budget. Now, interestingly, that agreed to budget is agreed to by no one. It is central government's diktat. There is no provision of consultation or consensus at all. So agreed to means dictated by the center. That agreed to budget was last year about 21 million person days. And in reality, the government supplies even gives money for less than that. Even those 21 million person days would amount to a budgetary provision of something around 60,000 crore rupees. What happens in reality is this, that some indication goes from the center कि भाई पैसा है. That goes down to the collector कि पैसा है, खुलवा दो कुछ. So the collector calls pradhans कि अच्छा कहाँ, अच्छा आपके यहाँ खुलवा लो, आपके यहाँ शुरू कर दो, नहीं आप शुरू मत करो, वहाँ शुरू कर दो. And then the person who is in charge says, okay, the work begins in the village. Because the supply always is more than demand. This is in a structural situation where there is always demand. Sorry, supply is always less than the demand. There is perennial demand. And there is perennial shortage of supply. So how does the central government ensure that states actually don't implement it properly? Because if they were to implement, central government will have to dish out money. What they do is that they squeeze the flow of money to the states. they say, हाँ देंगे, पैसा देंगे, अभी 3 महीने बाद. So for the last 2 or 3 years, it's a recurrent phenomena that at the end of the financial year, something to the tune of 10,000 crore rupees, last year it was actually 14,000 crore, which was unpaid to the states. Now clearly states, when they stop receiving money from the center, they stop work. So the center squeezes the release of funds, advance release of funds. States in turn squeeze the generation of employment. And that is how this wonderful demand-driven scheme is killed on ground. And on demonetization, the specific link is this. Therefore, because I read some reports in the media claiming, trying to read off from the numbers of Manrega generation, the reality of demonetization and reverse migration, etc. I was not so sure of those readings for this reason. Because Manrega generally reflects the supply situation. Manrega generally reflects the willingness on the part of the state government to open works rather than the intensity of demand. That's the real problem that we are dealing with. If I can just quickly make one point about demonetization. There is the economics of demonetization, there is the management of demonetization, there is the politics of demonetization. Economics, badly designed, misconceived. I'm not an economist. I've not heard a serious economist argue in its favor. Management, I don't even have to know management. I just have to know the size of 500 rupee note and the ATM size to know how badly it was managed. That's not the question. It was not an economic policy. It is politics. It's politically a very clever move, which plays on the moral economy of the peasant. I mean, in history, there's a lot of literature on the moral economy of the peasant. This is what it is trying to hit at. An ordinary Indian feels resentful of these rich people. It, for the first time, and I traveled on the ground, I met so many people. साहब 6 घंटा खड़ा रहा, नहीं मिला, बैंक मैनेजर आया ही नहीं. एक दिन पूरा खड़ा रहा साहब, 2 दिन खड़ा रहा. So what do you think of the policy? साहब काम ठीक कर रहा है यार. This is the essence of demonetization. It is a play on moral economy of the poor Indian. Yes, part of its benefits will be reduced gradually when the quotient of pain gain turns more towards pain and less gains, etc. But it will not be wiped out unless there is a credible moral voice. Simply saying there's too much pain in this process is not a response to the politics of demonetization. Unless there is a credible moral voice that can claim a moral ground and say, this is immoral. There is no political party in this country or no political leader which has been able to take that space. And that is why such an ill-conceived, poorly executed disaster continues in this country.
Yeah, okay, I don't entirely...
बहुत सारी कारण से महिलाओं को काम आपकी पुरुष को साथ लेके आओ तभी काम देगी, ये सब पहले से है. मगर अभी स्वच्छ भारत की वजह से टॉयलेट नहीं है तो काम नहीं है. This is the complaints from many states, including Tamil Nadu. So this is also ये भी एक कारण है कि reason to deny employment under NREGA.
Okay, I'm not so sure I agree with Yogendra, and we'll know on the 11th of March whether he's correct or not. But I also have a view.
That's not a verdict on demonetization.
No, the question is whether at all the outcome of the elections in the various states has, whether it has been how anti-incumbency or how anti-establishment is it? These are questions none of us have perfect answers to.
But Ajay, just one point.
We will come back to the budget.
Yeah, so I'm bringing this back to the budget from what Yogen said, is that, he was talking about the moral imperative and who has the moral imperative to actually say that this is the wrong policy in terms of the morality of it. The issue is that if all political parties are being funded by unaccounted income, then in that case, how can any of these, and even today they are, right? So you have ranges between 65% to 100% of funding where you don't have to tell the source of the donor. So therefore they cannot be, so if your entire system is being funneled today by unaccounted money starting from the politics of it, then who has that moral imperative?
Okay.
And therefore, I link it back to the budget. I would have said that a government, and I am not, a government which has taken this economic decision, and we can say that is actually a political decision, but even if it is political or economic, it is incumbent on the government which has taken it that it doesn't have to look for consensus on this issue, because it never sought consensus on demonetization.
All right.
And therefore, this particular thing about political party funding, there is totally in the control of the central government under the Income Tax Act. Today, if any charitable institution receives anonymous donations above 1 lakh, they have to pay a 30% tax on that donation. So there's a cost to it. That has not been implemented for political parties. That was the first logical thing to do. Because today, if you say for 20,000, I'm going to make the donation 2,000, then there are crores of Indians. Somebody who was saying that, I have 1 lakh donors is going to say that I have 20 lakh donors. But the minute you said that your entire anonymous donations, if you can't give the source, that will be taxed at 30%, there's a cost to it.
All right.
And that has not been done. And there
Absolutely correct.
That is an economic policy imperative, which is imperative on the government, because the government took the demonetization decision. It's not a political party.
All right. And to add to what you were saying, this reduction in the limit to the anonymous donations from 20,000 rupees to 2,000, which is supposed to be, which is indeed a recommendation of the Election Commission. What it doesn't also talk about is that it says political parties will be entitled to receive donations in check or digital mode when they were not entitled. When were they ever not entitled? But 1 minute. I think what is even more importantly, there is no scrutiny of income. Who audits the accounts of the
So
political
let me,
parties?
can I clarify this?
Yeah.
Just to take you to it. See, under the Representation of People's Act, with the Election Commission, you are supposed to give the source of all your donations except donations below 20,000, whether they're cash or in kind, whether non-cash. In 2003, the Income Tax Act was amended also. So political parties, their incomes from voluntary contributions, that is exempt from tax, but it is subject to certain conditions. This particular thing, that just as in the Representation of People's Act, also for incomes below, for voluntary contributions below 20,000, you are not obliged to give the source of the donor. That has also been imported into the Income Tax Act, and therefore you can still avail of the income of the exemption of a political party if it is below 20,000. Now that in the Income Tax Act has now been reduced to 2,000.
That's
In the
correct.
Representation
But-
of
but-
People's
but-
Act,
okay.
it still remains at 20,000.
1 minute.
But the problem there is that under the Income Tax Act, nobody is going to say that now if because you've received all your donations in cash, as long as you're saying that each of them is below 20,000,
Absolutely
the political party
correct.
does not lose it. The only way the political party can actually be made to shun these kind of donations is by actually the Income Tax Act is supposed to tax income. It's not an act where you are going to stop laundering of money. You
Correct.
can't raise that cost. In the demonetization exercise, what has happened? In the Income Tax Act, before this budget, any unexplained income of any individual or business, that is being now taxed at 70%. So correspondingly, any unexplained income or anonymous donation of a political party should at least be taxed at 30%. So essentially, that is something which the government could definitely have done even prior to the budget.
1 minute, okay. Yeah, please. I'll just add to a few points that Ashutosh has made.
If gentlemen sitting in the committee room think that they can control political parties by tinkering with acts, then I'm afraid you're never going to be happy. You'll always fail. These are political actions. Committee rooms cannot tinker with income tax acts to prevent political parties from using money laundering money for election purposes. That requires political mobilization. So I think this is a redundant.
Yeah, can I
Okay.
quickly
I
mention
don't
that-
agree that it's a
that the
direct
amounts-
conversation,
that the amounts-
because we're talking
yeah,
about
Ashutosh,
Income Tax Act, what you can take an action,
Ashutosh,
what you can't
the
do.
the amounts you're talking about are a small fraction of what parties actually spend. In 2015 and 16, the major political parties between them reported an expenditure of, I think, 4,000 crores, when all the evidence suggests that the actual expenditure in the election was close to 30,000. So all that you put in about all this.
Absolutely correct.
It'll ensure transparency on barely 10%.
Absolutely
what they
correct.
actually spent. Your real problem is the other stuff.
The
If
late
we are going to get this money where they bribe voters, etc., of handout and all that from their official thing which they report to EC.
and also we should keep in mind, I'll just give you an example. The late Gopinath Munde talked about how he spent 63 crores on his Lok Sabha constituency. It was a public statement, a public meeting. I think there's 2 points. The budget.
You get there on this.
I'm going to ask him. The budget does not promise scrutiny of income declared by political parties from various sources or the measures of penalization.
If there is a scrutiny, this is what I wanted to say. You see, under the Income Tax Act, if you want to keep your, your exemption, so you are subject to scrutiny. But my point is, the law itself says that you are allowed to take donations below 20,000. Then what will scrutiny entail? What they've tightened and said is that you also have to file your return by the due date.
And for your information, nobody does.
Yeah, so now, since you put that provision, so you were trying to implement, but coming back to what Mr. Desai was just saying, you're right. What political parties today are showing as their receipts, their expenditures today are in the multiples of 7 to 8 times outside that. So that anyway is part of that informal economy which we're talking about. But what I'm saying is that if you are saying that I have the political will to demonetize because I want to stop the high currency notes, held because that is a vessel to hold unaccounted money, then therefore, irrespective of whether you have a political consensus on 20,000 and 2,000, you can very well, under the Income Tax Act, which you amend through a budget process, you could very well say that anything which is an anonymous donation, whether below 2 or 20, will be subject to a tax of 30%. So there is a cost to it. So that is what
That is what is lacking.
So exactly. So at least for what you are actually showing as your receipts. See, today what is happening is 8 times what you're spending is outside, and even what you're spending 65 to 100% is also outside.
All right. And in case you want to know, according to the Association for Democratic Reforms, between 2010-11 and 2014-15, BJP defaulted in its submission of its audit report with the Election Commission of India by an average of 182 days, and the Indian National Congress 166 days. And even if you have what Mr. Jaitley said in his...
Any party submitted on time?
Nobody has. Precisely. The point is, so we have laws, they are more observed in the breach, and Mr. Jaitley said about this new scheme, about the amending the RBI Act, the Reserve Bank of India Act, to have these electoral bonds. If you go by what Mr. Jaitley said, he said these will also, no questions will be asked as to who has purchased the bonds. I mean, so where is this whole issue of transparency, etc.? You want to say something? Yeah, and
One man who is in the business, not us.
Only if I were in the business. I think there are 3 tiers of political funds. One is legal accounted political money, which is in the bank accounts. The second tier is political money, which is used by political parties to carry out its business of contesting elections and so on. And third is a personal political money which resides in the personal chests of political leaders. Very roughly speaking, again, these are numbers and one can put any number on that. For any 1 unit of legal political money which is in the bank accounts, there would be at least 10 units of the party political funds. And for every party political funds, there would be 10 times more of the personal political funds. So of 100 units of the political funds, only 1% is the one which resides in bank accounts. Why do they put even that 1% in bank accounts? Because there are certain expenditures that you cannot hide. Helicopters being hired, television things being done, etc. So because of that, political parties are forced to show some legal money. And these tiny little bits of 500 crore rupees, 1000 crore rupees, is that tiny little 1% that you and I keep debating about. We debate about it because of that famous thing that you must have heard. We keep looking for key, not where it was lost, but where the lamp happens to be. Since the lamp is here, then therefore I search for the key here. This one, so I mean, the two provisions introduced yesterday relate to that 1%. Both of them are bad provisions. The idea that by reducing 20,000 limit to 2,000, you have begun to address the problem, at least one initial step has been taken, is a completely misconceived idea, because the individual limit was never the real problem. The real question is, put together, how much can a political party receive from these unreported contributions? The answer yesterday was unlimited. The answer today is unlimited. So the party which yesterday got 100 crore rupees and told the accountant, make sure that everything's reported as less than 20,000, will again get 100 crore rupees and say, make sure it's under 2,000. So the accountant's fees may probably go up a bit. That's the only difference this will make, nothing else. The other provision of the bond, which I did not know very much about and did not understand fully till yesterday, but thanks to our RTI friend Venkatesh, who sent a mail, I think, to all of us today, this is actually draconian, this is very serious provision. Basically what it would do, this election bond, which I now understand fully and I didn't understand yesterday, basically what it would do is that it would make this 1% political funding almost completely opaque. So this is an anti-transparency measure. What would happen is this. I want to give some money to his party. For a change, let me say he's in politics and I'm not. So what I need to do is to go to my bank, buy a bond. Once I buy a bond, it's almost like a currency, except that the only person who can receive this currency is a registered political. I go and hand it over to him. He does not have to show that it came from me. So only my bank knows that I bought it. So whatever little once this is introduced, then why should anyone pay even the limited amount that they used to pay through check? Only a stupid person would now pay through a check. So whatever little transparency that existed for this 1% would also disappear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now let's talk about the budget a little bit. Let's go back to the budget. Everybody's saying, when are we going to talk about the budget? Well, the budget is not just a bland statement of accounts of the country. It's about the political economy of the country. I mean, all budgets are like that. This is not unique. Okay. I just want to just put out a few figures for you, and then you can come to tell me what you expect really. What you're assuming in the next financial year is a 17% growth in taxes, roughly. Excise, about 5% only. That's like not very, I mean, which shows that the government is perhaps recognizing that industry is, private industry in particular, investment in private industry hasn't picked up. What you're also assuming is, okay, corporate taxes go up by only 9%, and service tax, which has been the big cash cow of the government of late, will go by 11%. But the important thing that is being asked, that has been assumed in the budget, is that personal income tax collections would go up by 25%. Now this is 24.9, so I'm saying it's 25%. Is this realistic? Is it likely to happen? Is it because of a new kind of Inspector Raj, the year of the income tax man? Or is it that the government seriously expect that bulk of the income taxpayers, he said we are a largely tax non-compliant country, but after all this has happened, suddenly we become sadhus and sants and we become nice guys all over again and we start voluntarily paying tax. So this is the question I have. Rathin, you would like to take this question?
It's actually more helpful instead of doing the percentage numbers to look at the sensitivity. Remember that nominal GDP is expected to grow by 11.75%. If nominal GDP is expected to grow by 11.75%, every tax other than the personal income tax is going to grow by about the same or less than that. So, taxes on corporations will go down from 3.28% of GDP if the government meets its targets to 3.2%. Excise duties will go down from 2.57 to 2.42, and that's anticipating some, I think, GST loss. This is as percentage of GDP. And the service tax will stay about constant. Income taxes on personal account will go up from 2.34% of GDP to 2.62. 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. That's 0.28% of GDP, slightly more than a quarter of GDP. Is that doable? Of course. Because there is the tax gap, as we call it, in personal income taxes is so high that it would be fairly easy for the tax administration, in my view, to put in place a system where both the number of taxpayers assessed, this goes back to your point, and the number of people who should be paying more tax do pay more tax to happen. If only the government had withdrawn a few concessions, that would have been nice. So in that respect, I think that it's a doable target. Now, whether the income tax department, which I think is the biggest, I'll say this frankly, binding constraint, the tax authorities of this country, to raising the tax GDP ratio in India, because they have a vested interest, a huge vested interest in raising the tax GDP ratio, because then your discretion-based thing goes, your bribes go, what happens now in scrutiny is you get a scrutiny. Okay, somebody comes to you and says, okay, let's do a settlement. And then you sort of, so you have a deeply corrupt, let's be honest, Department of Direct Taxes, Department of Indirect Taxes. If somehow the government, and this goes back to your point, is going to claim the political will to reduce that corruption, I see no evidence of that. I'll give you an example why. When the VAT discussion was going on, and then people said that let the states collect the bulk of VAT, what the CBEC, this is the Maharajas of the indirect tax system, came up with was, oh, we lose our jobs, hum kya karenge? And that's not the important thing, the government listened to them. So make no mistake, these tax people are very powerful and very deeply embedded in the political system, in doing favors, in trading. I don't want to use a rude word, but it comes from a certain illegal activity. And this vested interest is going to make rules-based taxation very, very difficult. Unfortunately, this budget, since I've already said I see a reversion to discretion-based taxation, I do not find this number credible.
Okay, Paranjit, so
Yes,
can I
please.
on this?
And Renu, you haven't spoken for a while. May I ask Renu to speak and then
Sure,
Ashutosh you can
sure,
speak?
sure.
No, no, I'm just want to, add to Ratan's, just burnish what he said. I agree with him totally. On this tax reform bit and the, tax administration efficiency improvements, if we see the history of tax reforms in the past 25 years, since 91-92, we've had three sets of reforms. One at the level of the center, the second at the center of state, at the level of states, and the third one is to do with administration reforms. At the central level, we've had rationalization of direct taxes, simplification of the structures, lowering, beginning in 1997 with what was called a dream budget at that time. The second set of reforms has been at the state level, which is VAT. Started in 98-99, by 2007-8, all the states have come to adopt it. The third set of reforms are to do with improvements in tax administration, computerization, better monitoring, better compliance, etc., etc. And yet, if we see India's tax to GDP ratio over 2 decades, from the 90s to the 2000s, has risen only by 1 percentage point. So I have serious doubts as to where there has to be introspection as to why this is so. China instituted VAT much later than India did, and within few years it had raised up to 19% of GDP, its tax to GDP ratio. India's tax to GDP ratio remains one of the lowest with comparable peer countries. So if that is the case, then post demonetization, if 25% growth in the income tax, personal income taxes is expected on top of 18% growth last year, I'm not so optimistic as Ratin is. Now, in part it is that maybe they have got greater information, but there is nothing in the budget, on the reform side which buttresses or says that we are going to bolster the tax department, the income tax capacity, the wherewithals, their resources, and efficiency improvements. So I'm hugely skeptical.
Okay, all right. Yes,
So,
please,
as
Ashutosh.
I mentioned when I spoke earlier, and echoing what Ratin just mentioned, if I just look at the nominal growth rates, you're projecting 11.7 for 5% nominal growth rate and a 12.2% growth rate in taxes. Overall, it's a conservative figure, and as I said, but the components themselves, we shouldn't even be talking about the indirect tax components, because in the middle of the year, the tax bases are going to change hugely. The service tax and a lot of the excise is going to merge into GST or whatever. So therefore, overall, I would say it's been prudent that they've not, they've not budgeted for any buoyancy. It's just that. Now coming to the personal income tax, and this is what you see. Let's segregate where the problem in India lies vis-a-vis comparator countries are real. The India's corporate tax to GDP ratio is between 3.5 to 4%, 3.6, 3.7. It is the same average as in all OECD countries. The problem is the personal income tax. We were collecting less than 2% of our GDP as personal income tax. In all the major countries, it is above 6, even up to 10%, 6 to 8. So a huge gap which you see in India is because of the personal income tax. Now, why is the personal income tax low? Not all of them are, functions of corruption. There are other reasons also. One of the major reasons is that over the last decade, there has not been any growth in organized sector employment in India. Almost the entire sector is informal sector. Renu talked about a VAT, but the real efficiency of a VAT can only come in if there is a self-reporting. That because we never have had a nationwide VAT, and please understand, personal income tax evasion first happens because you first evade the indirect tax. So let me give you an example. If I am a small businessman, I am selling 100 rupees worth of goods. The first thing I want to evade is the sales tax or the VAT or whatever. So I show my turnover as 50 rather than 100. As 50 rather than 100. Similarly, if it is services, I will show the doctor whoever will show his receipt at half of it. So then what happens there is that correspondingly, therefore, there is a reduction in the income which I am showing for personal income tax. Therefore, the introduction of a GST, as has been said, would be the biggest boost if it is done efficiently, and it is a big if, given all the things which Ratin also talked about. Then you would have a boost to the indirect taxes, which again, indirect taxes in India, if you look at it overall, is the reduction of the collection is lower than what is there for comparator countries, and therefore there should be an independent reporting mechanism which boosts your personal income tax. And this would be something, a structural change, which of course, despite the corruption and all those other things which Ratin talked about. So therefore now the positive thing which has happened over the last, I would say 4-5 years is something because digital, one is tracking more, the computerization is better, is that from below 2% of GDP, personal income taxes, over the last 2-3 years, they have been increasing slightly. It's not enough because, so for decades it has been below 2. For decades it has been below 2. So the real challenge is, how do I, as Renu said, how do I bring this from a 2 to at least a 4%? That is the real challenge. And therefore, if I would say in the medium term, one of the ways in which you would judge monetization, demonetization, if it is being claimed, is that if not next year, but over the next 2-3 years, does this at least go up from a 2% to a 3%? And there, of course, there's the other variable, which is the GST, whenever that kicks in. So we should be looking at judging demonetization in the medium term and the efficacy of GST in the medium term, not just at the indirect taxes, but at the personal income tax rate. Do we at least bring it up to 4% of GDP?
Just one line, Paramjit.
Yes.
Now, you talked about GST and where the evasion is and why it is not captured. I want to qualify that as that much of India's, in fact, practically all of India's shifting shares of GDP from agriculture to manufacturing has taken place in the services sector. So taxation from evasion of indirect taxes as in purchase of goods cannot really be the issue. The issue is actually much of employment, whether it is self-employment or organized sector, has to be in the services sector. Service tax is paid on every services, at least everybody is billed for it, and in the last, if you see mid of 90s and particularly from the late 90s, the widening of the services tax net, and it has been huge. It has been enormous. The increase in service tax collections, initially from the widening of the tax net and then later on by huge increases in the service tax rates, have been humongous. So the issue is not that. The issue is of personal taxes from the services sector, and the inability of the tax administration, or you are talking about the evasion and the compliance from the assessee side. I agree with you, but at the same time, the tax administration has to respond to these changes, and obviously there is a fault there because of inefficiencies or inabilities to respond to changes wherein you are not the tax system has not been capturing. Like for example, more than 8 years ago, when Mr. Chidambaram was the finance minister, this PAN card was made a must for purchases of luxury watches, and all such. So what has happened thereafter? We should have seen, tax buoyancy increase. It has not increased. So that is why I remain very skeptical of the gains of GST as well. I wouldn't put it past the Indian system to sort of come up with dummy invoices and so on to evade the tax.
So I mean, I agree with Renu that, we are talking about different components. I am talking about a structural component which should, if it is properly handled, raise the PIT ratio, and that has actually been going up. As far as service tax is concerned, actually the rise in service tax has actually been majorly because the organized sector, which was already paying taxes, is also paying service tax. How service tax also gets, part of the GST basis, that now it gets subsumed in the GST. And as we know, the self-invoicing part of the GST is that until I have a taxpayer invoice, I cannot claim credit. So that will be whether it is for purchase of goods or whether it is for purchase of services. So I am not in disagreement with what Renu is just saying. It's just that there are certain structural things which should, besides demonetization, lead to a rise in the personal income tax, and if it isn't, then it is a failure of government.
Okay, my guess is that if you look at the 31st December speech, and also what Jaitley's references to the number of taxpayers, my guess is they're going to go after surveys, etc., raise this number of taxpayers. This is my guess, that they are really going to go after the surveys and so on. Because I think they made so much of it, both in the 31st December speech and also in the budget speech, that they have to show some results. If we end up the year with the same number of, more or less the same number of SSTs as before, then clearly you're not doing what you tried, you're failing.
Okay. All right. We are sort of running a little behind schedule, but we need to discuss the social sector, healthcare, education, and I think we need a few comments from all of us. I think Praveen would like to start with that.
On social sector.
Yeah. What the CBGA report has said, right? What the main point that they made is that it's hardly changed. Allocations to social sector programs have been retained at almost similar levels as last year, and it's given a detailed breakup.
So you already have the answer. As regards what has happened to the social sector, there's a lot of talk about it. In the aggregate, there is, of course, some increase, but then if you go scheme by scheme and if you look at a number of important components there, really the story is one where it's either stagnation or very, very tiny increase and so on. And if you sort of keep the larger picture of deficit that we have with respect to social sector, or whether it's education or health, I think Bore committee had talked of some 2-3% of GDP for health. Kothari committee had talked of 6% and so on. So if you recall all that, if you think in terms of what should be the appropriate unit costs to arrive at some realistic estimate, somebody might even say that it will probably require 10% of GDP today, right? 12% of GDP today, right? Now, if you do all that, obviously it's a very bleak picture that we are looking at, right? So I think we need to take both the short run and the longer term story into account. And here then finally we come to something which was being discussed earlier. What is it that is required to make sure that allocations improve in terms of at least taking into account unit costs and etc. Obviously you need to increase the fiscal space. How will that happen? That is the biggest question. That is a question which keeps getting sort of sidestepped, sidelined, brushed under the carpet and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, there is no sort of, if you want to call it political will, which is a funny phrase, but I mean nothing in these documents for the last several years, including the latest budget and the economic survey, etc., to even think of it. Yeah? This tax GDP ratio was talked about earlier. I mean, I have a small disagreement with Rathin on this. Actually, I mean, I don't think we need small governments. If we are thinking of, tax GDP ratio or expenditure GDP ratio as some kind of indicator of the size of the government, I mean, I think we really need to reach somewhere around what the BRICS average is.
I was not talking about small government, I was to clarify. I'm all for larger general government.
Right. No, but what is happening, Rathin, is that we are having every smaller government, except in a couple of states. You might find that the local government, for instance, in Kerala is something which is reasonably good and so on, but across the country, that's the sort of story which we have. And yes, on the principle of decentralization, etc., I'm in complete agreement with you. But in general, what's happening in the name of, efficiency and, talking about how the governments are not accountable and so on, essentially we have gone down a route which is to keep our both tax GDP and expenditure GDP, which are markers of fiscal space, disturbingly low. So how do we do that? So that's the big question.
Any maximum
Can I just,
governance, minimum
one
government?
small,
Yeah, sorry.
This demonetization and income tax increase, I don't see any connection, Ashutosh. Maybe we can talk about that outside the room, but I think it probably is not a very good idea.
No, but I never talked about income tax increase in demonetization.
He's saying the government's claim.
So that's why I'm saying, I'm also saying that claim has to be tested. Yes, exactly.
See, on this social